Recently, Riley Gaines attended a hearing in Washington, D.C. to speak on the issue of LGBTQ civil rights, and the antics that took place in that hearing are just unbelievable. Welcome to my channel, Outspoken Samantha. If you are new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you're returning, welcome back. I truly appreciate your continued support, and I hope that you are subscribed as well, particularly if you are on Rumble, because we do need to support platforms that support free speech, and YouTube just is not that. So I know that it has been a minute since I posted a video. There have been a few things going on. It's summer break. Everything is chaotic. I needed to move some things around so that I could record in a different room in my house to hopefully make my life a little bit easier. I've also gotten a little bit of, I've gotten some new software, some new programs to use. I've actually gotten a camera instead of just using my phone. So now I'm trying to adjust to using things that I'm not very familiar with. So the first couple of videos with this new equipment and the new software might be a little bit janky, but I appreciate you sticking with me through it. There have been so many things going on in the last couple of weeks that I've really missed talking about. So this is something that I wanted to touch on about a week ago when it happened. And now that I have the opportunity, we're going to get all caught up because this is just absolutely insane. So there was a hearing in Washington, D.C. that our girl Riley Gaines went to provide testimony to. And of course, she talked about her experiences of being forced to compete against a biological male, and just how that all played out. And again, having to reiterate how there was no choice for the women's team on whether or not this is something they wanted to do, and how this is starting to affect more and more women's teams across the country. And she's having to just go in and explain how this is a direct violation of women's rights. And yet somehow we have this entire group of people in society that seem to think that men and women are interchangeable, or that suddenly we can change someone's name and that just completely alters biological reality. And it's just completely crazy. And the fact that she has to go in there and explain these things to people that are supposed to be smart, that we elect as our representatives, that we put in front of different organizations to push human rights, to actually protect our rights, and for her to have to go in there and explain that this, their perceived idea of biological reality is completely false and baseless is just mind-boggling to me. So I wanted to go over a few of the clips that we saw and just some of the things that were even debunked, and just kind of the entire clown show and dumpster fire that this hearing was. So I don't know if I already mentioned it, but at first I thought that this was a hearing on the Equality Rights Act. I think it was honestly, it may have been just a discussion on LGBTQ civil rights. I'm not entirely sure, but we know that when the left presents a piece of legislation and they just kind of slap this label on it, that it does exactly the opposite of what the label says that that bill is going to do. The COVID relief bills were not actually for COVID relief, but for, it was for the current leftists in office to get to abuse their loosened spending power under the guise of being in a state of emergency, and only a small percentage of that legislation actually went to COVID relief. And then there were things like the Inflation Reduction Act that actually increased inflation, and then there's the Fiscal Responsibility Act that just recently passed, which is the polar opposite of fiscal responsibility. So again, whatever we get presented as a piece of legislation, whatever it is called, particularly when it comes out of the White House, there's a really good chance that you can just bet it is going to do the opposite of what we are told it's going to do. So I'm not sure if I can speak to whether this hearing is on the Equality Rights Act, but you can bet that the Equality Rights Act, among so many other things, it is going to make it virtually impossible for women to have the right to have private spaces without men in them. And it forces changes on Title IX that will make it so that sports teams cannot discriminate against men and boys that want to change their name or their identity and compete against women in these areas. And essentially that women just have to let these guys on their team, and there's nothing that they can do about it, which is supposed to give us equal rights. Not really sure how you make that work or how you quantify that, but that's what they're saying. But of course, we know that all of these changes to Title IX, it's going to eliminate the equality that Title IX actually established when it was implemented 50 years ago, and it makes it so all of women's sports teams are vulnerable to simply just becoming another version of men's sports. So in this hearing, we do hear from a few different people that really just make it amusing and frustrating all at the same time. So this first gal that we're going to hear from, her name is Kelley Robinson, and she's from something called the Human Rights Campaign, which is ironic because it should come with the disclaimer that she is all in favor of human rights unless you're a woman who doesn't want to undress in front of a naked man or have that naked man expose himself to you in the locker room. Otherwise, your rights don't matter and you need to be silenced because you are a hateful bigot. So that is the disclaimer that should come with Miss Robinson's advocacy for human rights. But we're going to listen to this clip because it contains a lot of fear mongering, and of course, the world is going to end if we don't go along with this agenda. So let's have a listen real quick.
On behalf of HRC's more than 3 million members and supporters, I've come here today with a single message. The LGBTQ plus people of the United States are living in a state of emergency. This is not an exaggeration. This is not a dramatization. More than 525 anti-LGBTQ plus bills have been introduced this year in the states. More than 220 of those bills target the transgender community, many targeting children, transgender children. And more than 75 of those anti-LGBTQ plus bills have now become law.
So here's the thing. I would actually wholeheartedly agree with Miss Robinson on this point that the LGBTQ community is living in a state of emergency because these kids are going into their school years fully expecting to get an education. They are completely fine in their identity. They are completely fine in who they are, at least if their parents are not leftists, which otherwise means there's a good chance that this child would go into kindergarten with blue hair and accuse all of their classmates of being oppressive, but the majority of them are just fine. But of course, people like Kelley Robinson want to fix that. These kids go in just fine, and they want to change that immediately. And just as an example, there's a Minnesota LGBTQ education specialist that thinks teachers should explain non-binary identities to preschools. This person name is Jason Buckland, and he was hired as an LGBTQ education specialist for Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Education, but he did give a lecture back in 2019 about how he thinks that we're actually harming kids by not raising kids from the time they're born to believe that gender is fluid. So let's look at this article just a little bit. It says, Jason Buckland, a recently hired LGBTQ education specialist for the Minnesota Department of Education, called for teachers to discuss non-binary identities with preschoolers in an unearthed 2019 public lecture. Buckland, who is involved in LGBT activism, called for children to learn about sexual orientation and non-binary identities as young as preschool and recommended projects for older students to learn that their gender is a social construct. He now plays a major role in promoting LGBT curriculum and policies in schools throughout the state. The talk was part of a series on inclusive classrooms put on by Achieve Twin Cities, a local educational organization. At the time, Buckland was the LGBTQ program director for Minneapolis Public Schools, according to his LinkedIn, a role that was tied to Out for Good, a program run by MPS to support LGBT students, staff, and families. Buckland promoted several LGBT-themed children's books during his lecture, including one on non-binary gender identities. We've been having questions about how do we explain non-binary identities to our preschoolers? If a teacher doesn't identify as a boy or girl, how do we explain that to our preschoolers who are just learning that there's only boys and girls? He said, promoting children's books about this subject as a solution. He complained that teachers don't discuss sexual orientation with children when they're in kindergarten and miss the opportunity to correct children who use gay as a pejorative. I find it interesting that we wrap someone's performance of masculinity to their sexuality, and we start doing that I've heard reports in the schools as early as kindergarten and preschool, he said. Sometimes as adults and educators, we get afraid to actually intervene and talk about what that word means. So what the result is for 6 years until we think it's developmentally appropriate to talk about it in a certain way. For 6 years, they get to develop a negative connotation between the word gay, meaning something bad. And then in 6th grade, we're supposed to untangle that. We've let them for 6 years learn a negative connotation between gay and something bad unless we interject. So first of all, we need to understand that little kids are not using the word gay as a pejorative because they have absolutely no idea what that word means. You have to intentionally go out of your way to be looking for examples of how teaching our kids to just be boys and girls is negative, to use the words, the ideas of 5-year-olds as an example. And if a kid is using the word gay in a negative way, the answer is to help them understand that that's not a nice thing to say, because it's virtually impossible for them to use that word in a way that isn't intentionally meant to hurt someone that is gay. But in the minds of people like Jason Buckland and Kelley Robinson, the solution is to teach all 20 to 30 kids in that class that gender is fluid and that their parents are oppressing them by calling them a boy or a girl for the first 5 to 6 years of their life, and then, the first few years of their educational experience. So this is what is leading kids to be in this crisis mode. You're taking kids who are mentally and psychologically thriving and then immersing them into an ideology that was founded by child predators, and your intent on imposing discomfort, the intent is to impose discomfort on these kids who would have been perfectly fine had you not done that. And these laws that people like Jason Buckland and Kelley Robinson are saying are targeting children are actually meant to protect these kids from people like Jason and Kelley, who are targeting kids with destructive ideas that are going to lead them down a path where they are led to hate their own bodies. These laws are protecting kids from activists who are lying to them and telling them that they can just put a pause on their puberty with these potent drugs and that there aren't going to be any permanent side effects, who will lie to them and tell them that wearing a chest binder is completely safe, or that there are no long-term consequences to tucking your genitals every single day, who will tell a boy that the effects of taking large doses of estrogen are 100% reversible, and tell a girl that the effects of taking large doses of testosterone are going to completely disappear once she stops. These are the people that are going to target these kids with false and manipulative statements like what this woman has to say.
We have a clinical experience of more than 20 years and a robust body of evidence that supports this treatment as life-saving, decreasing depression and anxiety. There are no other studies that support any other treatment. So this is the mainstream treatment. We have a clinical experience of more.
You know what I found? And this has been supported by numerous doctors who have actually analyzed the data out there based on studies of the well-being and outcomes of kids who receive this thing called gender affirming care. The studies that confirm that these drugs and surgeries are saving lives, they have very small sample sizes. They do not conduct these studies in a way where they compare kids who struggled with gender dysphoria yet were not pushed into drugs and surgeries against kids who had dysphoria and were pushed in this direction. The outcomes are usually within just a few years at most, and it's even being discovered that a lot of kids who express dissatisfaction with their transitioning do not return to the same doctor who they worked with in their transition in the first place because they don't trust them. And these studies would exist if these activist doctors like this woman were actually so confident that the drugs and the surgeries that they were prescribing to these kids were actually making them happy, that they could conduct a study to compare kids who had discomfort with their body but didn't engage in drugs and medical procedures against those who don't. They'd be conducting the studies themselves if they thought even for a second that it would confirm that these kids are as happy as they say they are with their drugged and mutilated bodies. But they don't conduct these studies. In fact, they silence a lot of doctors who want to conduct these studies and to confirm statements like there are no other studies that support any other treatment, or confirm the things that this woman is saying, because they want to make sure that the standards of care are accurate, that what they're being treated for and what they're being prescribed is actually having the outcome that they say that it is. And thankfully, I think there are more studies being done by honest doctors who actually want fact and data-based information, and they are showing that what this doctor right here is saying is 100% false, that psychological therapy would absolutely solve the discomfort that these kids might be feeling momentarily. Just like it's helpful with depression and body dysmorphia and any other situations where you think your body might be fat when you're really underweight, or anything where you're looking in the mirror or you're thinking something about your body and about your mind that isn't actually accurate. And then we have to get to the clips of Riley Gaines proving that these human rights activists are just doctors that want to push a particular agenda and actually do not care about the well-being or rights of anybody but themselves. And they actually prey on children and teens who are struggling with something in their lives so that they can tell them that destroying their body is the answer. So she literally does blow them out of the water.
Talking about just the incredible surprise, shall I say, to put it gently, of finding a biological man, a 6'4" biological man in your locker room, and having to accept that without being asked about it, without being told about it even. What was that like for you? Tell us about that.
Again, we only became aware we would be undressing next to a man was when we had to see a man undressing while we were simultaneously undressing. And so I immediately left the locker room and I went up to one of the officials on the pool deck and I said, what are the guidelines to allow a man into our locker room? I know the guidelines for the competition, but what are the guidelines for the locker room? And he so nonchalantly said back, oh, we actually got around this by making locker rooms unisex. And so I'm thinking to myself in these brief moments, first and foremost, you just admitted this is a male by acknowledging how you had to change your rules to make the locker rooms unisex. You acknowledge that we do not share the same sex, first and foremost. Secondly, unisex? Any man could have walked into our locker room, any coach, any official, any man who wanted to would have had full reins to, and bare minimum we weren't forewarned about it. And that's the traumatizing part. Of course, the experience in and of the locker room itself is traumatizing, but I think for me, it was so easy for them to dismiss our rights to privacy.
In a hearing about civil rights or human rights of any kind, where you've got a human rights activist or advocate here, like, what else needs to be said? Like, if trans women are women, why would you need to change the bathroom to intersex? You could just leave it as a women's bathroom. But they didn't, because they know that this whole thing is just full of crap. Secondly, these women were forced into this situation where they had to undress next to a man, and they were forced into a situation where they had to expose their bodies to him without their consent. They were not asked, and when they said, we're not okay with this, they were essentially told to sit down and shut up. And if you listen to the account by Paula Scanlon, they were essentially told, don't make a big thing of this or you will regret it. And you have to wonder, where else is this happening behind the scenes with different sports teams, and why we're not seeing more women speak up? Because you have to wonder, are they being threatened as well and told to just not say anything and to just go along with it, where otherwise their careers or their reputation will be threatened? And I cannot reiterate enough, they know that this stuff is false. They know it's a lie. They know that they are taking women's rights away. They just depend on their base, taking their word at face value and never questioning anything. Because if you were to question them and do your own digging, you'd be called out for lying, just like what happened here.
Women
You
and some
don't
that are
believe
short.
that a biological male has a physical advantage in sports over a biological female?
Not as a definitive statement.
Give me an example. Well, no, I don't think. How many female members of the NBA do you see?
Well, I can say that, there's been this news article about men that think that they could beat Serena Williams in tennis, right? That they think that they could actually score a point on her. And it's just not the case. She is stronger than
James,
that.
what's your experience, Ben? male, female?
Both Serena and Venus lost to the 203rd ranked male tennis player, which they're phenoms for women.
Oops. And that's how this works. They'll just put something out there, counting on their base to not do their own research, to not look into the thing that they just said, and then just start spreading it around as fact, and then hopefully use it as a motivator to vote for these people who are speaking truth when that person's name is on the ballot. That is, until that talking point fails miserably when someone actually does bring facts into the equation. Because it is a fact that Serena and Venus Williams lost to the 203rd ranked tennis player when they competed against him. And that competition happened in 1998 in a battle of the sexes, but recently Serena Williams did say this, if I can unpause it.
He was been joking about myself and him playing a match, and I'm like, Andy, seriously, like, are you kidding me? Because for me, tennis and men's tennis and women's tennis are completely almost two separate sports. So I'm like, if I were to play Andy Murray, I would lose 6-0, 6-0 in 5 to 6 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Because no, it's true. It's true. It's a completely different sport. The men are a lot faster. They serve harder, they hit harder. It's just a different game, and I love to play women's tennis. And I only want to play girls because I don't want to be embarrassed. I would not do the tour. I wouldn't do Billie Jean any justice. So Andy, stop it. Yeah. I'm not gonna let you kill me.
So I wouldn't be surprised if Kelley Robinson ends up editing that little clip, her exchange with Senator Kennedy, just to make it sound like what she said was actually factual. But honestly, it's just nothing but mind games and manipulation. If any of these people were confident in this stuff, that men and women were the same, that men competing against women was truly a demonstration of equality, and that bullying women into silence was a sign of equality, they just wouldn't have to lie. They wouldn't have to make statements that were just completely false. And then to just tie up this entire hearing in a nice little padded box, Kelley Robinson just goes on this little exchange between herself and Ted Cruz, and it just completely shows how insane all of this is.
Ms. Robinson, do you agree with Ms. Gaines that there's a difference between women and men?
If the question is about trans women,
I'm just asking, is there a difference between women and men?
what I can say is that the NCAA has rules in place. They've had rules in place for the last decade, and when this competition happened,
I'm going to try again.
The rules were clear.
Do you believe there's a difference between women and men? It's a yes/no question. Do you believe there's a difference?
Oh, I think that we're talking about this case with the NCAA.
No, I'm asking a question. Do you believe there's a difference between women and men? Most people could answer this very simply. I'm curious if you're willing to do so.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just putting it into the context of the conversation that we're having. I think that there are definitions related to sex.
Is
but
that
I
a
also
yes?
think
So I'm
that
trying to get a yes or no. I'm not trying to get a speech. Is there a difference between women and men?
I think that there are definitions for biological sex.
Okay, so you're
which
not
is
answering
different
that.
than
Let me ask
gender.
you this question then. Why do women's sports exist? If you can't define a difference between women and men, why not abolish women's sports and just tell little girls to swim with little boys and see who wins?
Oh, I'm simply saying that that sex is
My
different
question,
than gender.
why
and I do believe
why
that
do
women's sports have a
sports
great
exist?
value. I mean, Senator, I'll tell you right
Ms.
now.
Robinson, please answer the question.
We don't need to finish watching that whole thing. She knows that there is a difference between men and women. She knows that there are only two biological sexes, and she knows that gender is just a label that we use to assign to people once we know what your biological makeup is. That's why when we see a baby when it's born, we can look at their anatomy and determine immediately which label they get. And there are only two, and Kelley Robinson knows this. So to sit and go back and forth in this little game is absolutely ridiculous. And then just to smile like she doesn't understand the question, I don't know what the point of that is, because it just makes you look like an idiot. And it goes without saying that because of this insanity, women are losing rights in America, and it's people who claim to be the advocates for human rights and part of human rights campaigns like Kelley Robinson who are leading the charge in the loss of those rights. So I know this was a little bit of a longer video, but I really wanted to touch on all of these clips and just kind of tie it all up in a nice little bow. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. Again, thank you for being patient with me as I test out this new equipment and camera. I noticed that it's kind of going in and out of focus throughout the video, so I apologize for that. I will get those things fixed. I plan to do more live streams now that I have the ability to do so. Again, I truly appreciate your support on my channel. Please, if you feel so inclined, hit the little thanks button and support the channel through a small donation. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one. Bye.